It started with small things. At first, Thomas didn't even think to connect them. A forgotten dinner, an odd moment of silence, a look that lingered just a second too long. In a house that had been bustling with warmth and routine for years, the subtle shift in atmosphere was barely perceptible until it wasn't. He came home one evening from work to find the living room unusually quiet. His wife, Caroline, was out grocery shopping and the television was off. The only light came from the kitchen, and as he stepped closer, he caught the sound of low voices, his son Daniel, and Caroline's best friend, Lena. Lena had been part of their lives for over a decade. She was Caroline's best friend from college, a frequent visitor during the holidays, birthdays, and barbecues. Recently divorced and with nowhere to go for a while, she had moved in temporarily 2 months ago, just until she got back on her feet. Thomas hadn't objected. Lena was a charismatic woman, smart, assertive, always laughing just a bit too loudly. But now, the laughter was gone, replaced by something quieter, more insidious. That night, when he entered the kitchen, the conversation between Lena and Daniel stopped abruptly. Lena turned to greet him, smiling as if nothing had happened, while Daniel nodded quickly and walked out of the room without another word. It nagged at him, but he let it go. A week later, Thomas began noticing Daniel's moods fluctuating more than usual. The young man, once ambitious and light-hearted, had grown sullen and sharp. He argued over trivial matters, skipped family meals, and stayed out late without explanation. Caroline chalked it up to stress. Daniel was finishing his final year at university and had recently ended a short relationship with a girl named Talia. "He just needs space," she said. "Let him be." Thomas tried. He really did. He offered to grab lunch together. Daniel declined. He offered help with a project. Again, dismissed. Something was off, but Daniel wouldn't talk, and Thomas didn't want to push too hard. His son had always been private, but what he couldn't ignore was Lena's increasing presence. Not just in the house, but in Daniel's orbit. One Saturday morning, Thomas passed Daniel's bedroom and found the door slightly ajar. Inside, Lena sat on the edge of the bed, leaning close while Daniel looked down at his phone. It was an intimate pose, too intimate. She laughed at something, reached out to touch his shoulder. It wasn't overtly sexual, but it sent a chill down Thomas's spine. He cleared his throat loudly from the hallway. Lena looked up casually, as though her being in there was the most natural thing in the world. "Morning, Tom," she said brightly. "Just checking in on this lazy one. He's not even out of bed yet." Daniel barely looked at him, just muttered something and pulled a pillow over his face. At dinner that evening, Thomas tried to bring it up subtly. "Lena," he said over the clatter of plates, "you and Daniel seem to be spending a lot of time together lately." Caroline raised her eyebrows, curious. Lena chuckled. "Oh, Tom, don't start getting jealous," she teased. "I'm just trying to be a good influence. You know, mentoring the poor boy since he's clearly lacking a love life." Daniel smirked at his food. Caroline laughed. "Honestly, it's sweet of her. She's been helping him figure things out." Thomas forced a smile, but his gut tightened. He didn't know what bothered him more, the way Lena said it, or how Caroline brushed it off. Over the following days, he became more watchful. There were moments when Lena would disappear for hours and reappear with no clear explanation. He once saw her sneaking a bottle of wine into Daniel's room late at night. And when he confronted her the next morning, she claimed it was just a little heart-to-heart to help him with his breakup. She brushed his concerns aside, casually like swatting a fly. But things began escalating. Daniel had stopped attending his part-time job entirely. He'd withdrawn from his friends. One of them, Jake, called the house looking for him and mentioned that Daniel hadn't shown up to group meetings in weeks. That was a red flag. Daniel had always been dependable, especially about school. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Thomas sat in the living room nursing a glass of whiskey. He couldn't sleep. The house felt thick with tension, and he didn't trust it anymore. Just after midnight, he heard quiet footsteps on the stairs. He killed the lamp and waited. He watched Lena, barefoot and in a silk robe, glide down the hallway toward Daniel's room. She paused at the door, looked around, and went in. He froze. Thomas sat there in the dark for almost 10 minutes, unable to move, his heart pounding. He wanted to storm up there, to yank the door open and scream, But what if he was wrong? What if it was innocent? What would he say? That he'd been watching? That he suspected his wife's best friend of seducing his son? He needed proof. The next morning, he told Caroline that he thought Lena had overstayed her welcome. It had been months now, and the temporary visit had turned into a near-permanent arrangement. Caroline defended her fiercely. She has nowhere else to go. She's finally starting to recover. And now you want to kick her out? I want our house back, Thomas said. It doesn't feel like ours anymore. Then say what you really mean, Caroline snapped. You just don't like her. You never did. Thomas didn't answer. There was no point arguing until he had something concrete. That afternoon, he noticed Daniel had left his laptop open on the dining table. He hesitated, then sat down and tapped the screen. It was locked, but not fully shut down. A messaging app blinked at the bottom corner. Temptation gnawed at him. He knew it was a violation of privacy, but something in his gut told him he had a look. He tried a few common passwords, birthdays, favorite sports teams, and on the fourth attempt, the lock screen vanished. The chat history made his blood run cold. He found a private thread between Daniel and Lena. It wasn't graphic, but it didn't need to be. There were messages full of affection, suggestive compliments, playful flirtation, and worst of all, emotional manipulation. Lena told Daniel things like, "You're more of a man than your father will ever be, and no one understands you like I do." She called him handsome, strong, and even once mine. She urged him to stop letting your mom control your choices and start living for yourself. Thomas's hands shook as he read through it. This wasn't mentorship. This was grooming. He closed the laptop and sat in silence. The pieces started falling into place. Daniel's rage, Lena's hostility toward him, Caroline's blindness. And now, he had something real, something undeniable. But what haunted him more than Lena's words was Daniel's response. He hadn't resisted. In fact, he welcomed it. The messages were mutual, even if one party clearly held more power. Thomas knew what he had to do. He wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. But now he would prepare. He would document, gather, and protect his family, even if it meant breaking it apart first. And for the first time in years, Thomas realized the biggest threat to his marriage wasn't another man. It was a woman sleeping 2 doors down. The days that followed felt like walking through a field of landmines. Thomas never knew what would trigger the next explosion. He watched, silently, as the walls of his home slowly absorbed more poison. There was a coldness that had settled in the rooms, like something rotting beneath the floorboards, unseen but impossible to ignore. Now that Thomas had read the messages between Lena and Daniel, he couldn't unsee the truth, no matter how much he wanted to. He didn't confront either of them immediately. Instinct told him that a direct accusation, made without airtight evidence, would backfire. Lena was manipulative, yes, but not stupid. If she sensed a threat, she would twist the narrative in her favor. And Daniel, his son, was far too deep in her web to see things clearly. So Thomas did what many fathers in his position would do. He watched. He listened. He prepared. Daniel was no longer the young man Thomas remembered from just a year ago. The boy who once used to help him mow the lawn on Sundays, who used to geek out over football stats, who laughed too hard at dumb action movies. That boy was gone. In his place was someone hardened, closed off, and erratic. His eyes were constantly bloodshot, not from drugs, Thomas suspected, but from sleepless nights, internal conflict, and the emotional toll of being caught in something he didn't fully understand. Caroline remained oblivious. She was preoccupied with a big project at the design firm where she worked, and Lena was always around to help with dinner or listen to her complaints over wine. To Thomas, it felt like Lena was slowly replacing him, subtly erasing his presence, and inserting herself deeper into every corner of their lives. She played the role of loyal best friend so convincingly that even Thomas began to question himself at times. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe he was just being paranoid. But then he'd remember the texts. The digital trail of seduction, the subtle attacks on his authority, and the increasing emotional distance of his son. One night, he saw Lena come out of Daniel's room again. This time, her robe was tighter, and her lipstick had clearly been reapplied. She jumped slightly when she saw Thomas sitting on the stairs in the dark, watching her. She recovered quickly. "Oh, Thomas," she said softly. "You startled me." "Late night chat?" he asked, voice even. She gave a tired smile. "Daniel's having trouble sleeping. Still heartbroken over Talia. I was just giving him some advice." He nodded slowly. "That's very maternal of you." She held his gaze a moment longer than was comfortable before walking past him and disappearing into the guest room. That night, Thomas opened a new folder on his laptop and labeled it for Caroline, only if necessary. Into it, he copied screenshots of Lena and Daniel's messages, time-stamped and organized. He made backups on a flash drive and uploaded a copy to a private email account only he knew about. If things spiraled out of control, at least he'd have something no one could deny. Over the next few days, Daniel's behavior worsened. He snapped at his mother over nothing. When Caroline reminded him about picking up groceries for the week, Daniel exploded, shouting that he wasn't her damn errand boy. Thomas intervened, and the exchange turned into a shouting match that ended with Daniel slamming his bedroom door hard enough to rattle a picture frame off the wall. That night, Thomas quietly entered Daniel's room while he was out. He knew it was a breach of privacy. He hated himself for it, but he needed to understand how deep this went. The room smelled like sweat and anxiety. On the desk were 2 wine glasses, one with lipstick residue. The bedsheets were crumpled and reeked of Lena's perfume. A drawer held a small box of condoms. His heart sank. Downstairs, Lena was preparing tea as if she hadn't just broken every rule of decency. "Long day?" she asked without looking up. Thomas walked up slowly. "Did you sleep with him?" She froze. Her hand hovered over the kettle. Slowly, she turned, a smirk spreading across her lips like venom. "Excuse me? You heard me." She tilted her head. "Are you seriously accusing me of something like that?" "I'm not accusing. I'm asking." She stepped forward, just enough to invade his space. "Careful, Thomas. That's a dangerous accusation. Do you really want to go down that road without proof?" "I have proof," he said, keeping his voice level. "Messages. Screenshots. I've seen what you've been saying to him." Her expression didn't change. She smiled wider. "Then I hope you also saw what he said to me." That made his stomach drop. Of course. Lena had never initiated anything graphic in writing. It was all suggestive, psychological. And Daniel, young, confused, manipulated, had said things that could make it seem like he was pursuing her. She could turn the entire story around with a few carefully selected screenshots of her own. "I'm not the predator here," she said calmly. "Maybe you should take a harder look at your son. Maybe he's not the innocent boy you think he is." Thomas wanted to scream. He wanted to shake her, throw every accusation at her face, but he knew better. She was testing him, waiting for him to lose control so she could weaponize it later. He stepped back. "This ends now." She shrugged. It never really started. After she left the kitchen, Thomas sat at the table with his face in his hands. He had never felt so powerless in his own home. Lena had constructed a perfect trap, seduced the son, gaslight the father, blind the mother. Every angle was covered, every move calculated. He needed help, but who could he trust? He called an old friend from college, Ethan, a retired therapist who now worked part-time as a counselor for at-risk youth. Without naming names, Thomas laid out the situation in vague terms. A friend's son involved with an older woman staying in the family home. Ethan didn't hesitate. "That's grooming," he said bluntly. "Emotional entanglement, imbalance of power, psychological dependency. It's textbook. What should I do?" "Remove one of them from the house." Immediately, Thomas exhaled. "That's not so easy. You need to talk to your wife." "I can't yet. She won't believe me. Not without seeing it for herself." "Then make her see. But don't wait too long. Emotional manipulation like this can leave scars that last a lifetime. And if this woman has any history of this behavior, it's only going to get worse." That night, Thomas sat alone in the living room again. Caroline had gone to bed early with a headache, and Lena was locked in her guest room. Daniel, however, wasn't home. It was after midnight. He hadn't texted or called. Thomas didn't even know if he would come home at all. At 2:14 a.m., Daniel finally walked through the door, visibly drunk and unsteady. Thomas caught him in the hallway. "Where have you been?" he asked quietly. Daniel glared. "Out. Drinking? None of your business." Thomas looked at his son, really looked and realized just how much damage had been done. This wasn't the same boy who once looked up to him. This was a confused, emotionally wrecked young man who had been caught in the eye of a storm he didn't even understand. "She's using you," Thomas said softly. "Lena, she's not your friend. She's not in love with you. She wants to ruin this family." Daniel laughed bitterly. "You think this is about her? You think everything's fine except for Lena? Maybe you should look at yourself, Dad." And with that, he stormed off. Thomas stood in the hallway, the silence roaring louder than any argument. He realized then that confronting Lena hadn't changed anything. If anything, it had made things worse. The woman who was once a guest in their home had now embedded herself so deeply that removing her would require tearing something else apart. But he was done watching. He would confront her again, but this time he'd do it with witnesses, with documentation, and he'd make sure his wife knew everything, even if it shattered what little piece they had left. Thomas awoke the next morning with one decision etched deep into his mind. The silence was over. He had spent too many nights calculating, too many mornings pretending not to notice the fractures deepening beneath his family's surface. The woman poisoning their home was no longer just a problem. She was a threat. And Thomas had reached the point where maintaining the illusion of peace had become more dangerous than destroying it. He waited for the right moment. That Sunday morning, Caroline decided to go for a walk in the park to clear her head. She invited Lena along, but Lena declined with a fake yawn and a claim that she didn't sleep well. Thomas offered to stay behind and cook breakfast. Caroline kissed his cheek and left with a hopeful smile, oblivious to what was about to unfold. Thomas stood in the kitchen, cutting fruit he didn't plan to eat, waiting for Lena to emerge. It didn't take long. She strolled into the room wearing one of Caroline's old sweatshirts and a smugness she didn't bother to conceal anymore. "Where's Caroline?" she asked casually, pouring herself a glass of juice. "Out," Thomas replied, placing the knife down carefully. "We're alone." Lena raised an eyebrow. How very cinematic. He looked at her directly. "We need to talk." She leaned against the counter, glass in hand. "Is this about last night? Because if you're here to issue more vague threats, don't bother." "I already told you." Thomas cut her off. "I'm not here to threaten. I'm here to give you a choice." That surprised her. She blinked and gave a little laugh. "A choice? You leave this house. Today. You pack your things, you get in your car, and you never contact Daniel again." She set the glass down with a click. "You don't get to tell me what to do, Thomas. This isn't your kingdom. I've been here long enough to know. Caroline makes the decisions, not you." "I'm not asking," he said quietly. "And if I don't?" She challenged, her eyes narrowing. He walked to the dining table, opened his laptop, and turned the screen toward her. The folder was labeled clearly, Lena, full record. He clicked through it, screenshots of messages, timestamps, notes. It was organized, undeniable. She stared at the screen, expression blank for a moment. Then she rolled her eyes. "You really think Caroline's going to believe your version of this?" She said. "You went through his messages. You invaded your son's privacy. If anything, you'll look like the controlling, paranoid father who couldn't handle that his son is growing up. You're grooming him," Thomas said calmly, "and manipulating my wife. And you've been living here for free, poisoning all of us." Lena stepped closer, her voice cold. "Let me tell you something. Your family was broken long before I got here. Your wife? She's lonely. You're emotionally absent, and she knows it. And your son? He's starving for validation. I gave him something you never did, attention, respect. He came to me." "No," Thomas said, voice steady. "You made sure he needed you. You filled the gaps just enough to trap him. And I'm not letting it continue." Lena crossed her arms. "And what will you tell Caroline? That you were spying on everyone? That you snuck into Daniel's room like some creeper? Go ahead. Make yourself look like the villain. I'll deny everything. I'll cry. She'll believe me. She always does." Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the hallway, retrieved a small digital voice recorder from his pocket, and pressed stop. Lena's eyes widened. "What the hell is that?" "Insurance," he replied. "You recorded me?" She hissed. "That's illegal. In this state?" He said coolly. "No. One-party consent. And even if I can't use it in court, I can play it for Caroline." She stared at him, the mask slipping slightly. She wasn't smiling anymore. He continued, "You have until the end of the day to leave. You walk out of this house, and I won't involve anyone else. You can go quietly, or I can make this public. Your name, your messages, your voice, everything. Daniel may hate me for a while, but he'll eventually understand. My wife might never forgive me for letting this go on so long, but at least I'll know I did something." Lena stepped back, her confidence cracking. For the first time, she looked small, cornered. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You really think this will fix your family?" "No," he said honestly, "but it's the only chance we've got." She stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked out without another word. Thomas stood frozen in the kitchen, heart pounding, adrenaline shaking his hands. He didn't know if she would really leave. He didn't know what Caroline would say when she found out. He didn't know what Daniel would do when he realized what had happened behind closed doors. All he knew was that the confrontation was over, and now the fallout would begin. 3 hours later, Lena left. No dramatic scene, no final insults. Just the dull sound of a suitcase dragging across the floor and the click of the front door closing. Thomas waited until Caroline came home. He didn't know how to begin, but there was no point delaying anymore. He sat her down on the couch and showed her everything. The messages, the screenshots, the audio file. Her expression morphed slowly from confusion to disbelief to something beyond pain. She didn't cry right away. She asked questions in a flat voice. How long he'd known, why he hadn't told her sooner. Then the tears came, silent and crushing. She blamed herself. She blamed him. She blamed Lena. It came in waves, each one more devastating than the last. "I trusted her," she whispered. "I defended her. I invited her in." Thomas didn't try to excuse anything. He simply sat with her, the weight of the truth between them too heavy to shift. He confessed that he had waited too long to act, that he hadn't wanted to believe what he was seeing, that he was scared it would all come apart if he did. Caroline didn't respond. She just got up and walked into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. That night, Daniel didn't come home. Thomas sat alone in the living room once again, the house eerily quiet. But for the first time in weeks, it felt like the air had changed. It wasn't cleaner. Not yet. But the tension was gone, replaced by a hollow stillness. A kind of emotional vacancy that signaled an end, but maybe, just maybe, also a beginning. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. The house that once held so much warmth was now a fragile shell. But Lena was gone. The infection had been removed. Now came the painful task of healing. The house didn't feel like home anymore. Not immediately. The silence that followed Lena's departure wasn't peaceful. It was raw and echoing, like the air after a thunderclap. It carried the scent of betrayal, shame, confusion, and something else harder to define. For Thomas, the silence was both a relief and a sentence. He had done what he had to do, but nothing about it felt triumphant. The rod had been cut out, but the wound was wide open. Caroline barely spoke to him for 3 days. She went to work, came home, made tea, and spent long stretches alone in the bedroom with the door half closed. Thomas didn't press. He gave her space while quietly managing everything else: laundry, dinner, even the dog's vet appointment that she usually handled. At night, he sat by himself in the living room, watching old films they used to enjoy together, but they no longer brought comfort. Every scene felt like a memory tainted by the lie that had lived in their home for far too long. Daniel didn't return for nearly a week. Thomas received a single message the day after Lena left: "I need time. Don't contact me." It was vague and defensive, but Thomas didn't push. He knew his son was reeling, discovering that the adult woman he had trusted, possibly even loved, had manipulated him into becoming the wedge in his parents' marriage couldn't be processed overnight. Thomas only hoped that, given distance and perspective, Daniel would eventually understand he hadn't been complicit. He had been used. On the 7th day, Daniel walked through the door without a word. He looked rough. His beard had grown in patches, and his eyes were bloodshot. He dropped a backpack near the stairs and made his way to the kitchen. Thomas stood in the doorway, unsure what to say. The weight between them was enormous. "I heard she's gone," Daniel finally said, his voice low and gravelly. Thomas nodded once. She left last Sunday. Daniel leaned on the counter, staring down at the wornwood. I went to see her before that. She said you threatened her. I confronted her, Thomas replied calmly. I told her what I knew, showed her the evidence. And you recorded her? I did. Daniel's jaw tensed. He looked angry, more at himself than anything else. I didn't know how far it had gone. I don't know. I thought she cared about me. She played you, Thomas said quietly. She manipulated you into believing it was more than what it was. That's not your fault. Daniel ran a hand over his face. You don't get it. I liked the way she made me feel. For once I felt needed, respected. She listened. I felt like an adult when I was with her. She knew exactly how to create that illusion, Thomas said gently. That's what people like her do. Daniel didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes glassy. I didn't know how to stop it. You weren't supposed to, Thomas said. She didn't want you to stop. She wanted to ruin this family. Daniel looked up sharply. Why? Jealousy. Bitterness. Maybe loneliness. I don't know exactly. But it wasn't about you. And it wasn't about your mother either. It was about control. There was a long pause between them, the first in months that didn't feel toxic. Daniel finally looked at his father, really looked at him, and said, I'm sorry. Thomas stepped forward and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Me too. That evening, the three of them sat down for dinner for the first time in weeks. Caroline didn't speak much, but she didn't walk away either. The air was heavy with emotion, but the presence of all three at the same table again, sharing food, if not words, was a start. After the dishes were cleared, Caroline turned to Daniel and asked quietly, Did she ever tell you not to talk to me? Daniel nodded. She said you wouldn't understand me, that you treated me like a boy, that you wanted me to be like Dad. Caroline blinked, clearly pained. I'm sorry if I made you feel that way. I think I wanted to believe her, Daniel admitted. It was easier than facing the stuff I didn't want to talk about. We all wanted to believe something easier, she said, her voice thin. I wanted to believe my best friend loved us, that she was helping us. And I wanted to believe we were still a close family, Thomas added, even when we were all drifting away from each other. There was silence again, but this time it was softer, less like an accusation and more like a collective breath. Over the next few weeks, things didn't magically heal, but they slowly began to reset. Daniel started seeing a counselor provided by the university. Caroline took some time off work. She and Thomas began attending couples therapy, not because they were on the brink of divorce, but because they knew they needed to rebuild what had cracked, and neither of them wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. Lena didn't attempt to contact any of them. Thomas later found out from a mutual acquaintance that she had moved to another city, taken a short-term job, and kept her head down. Whether out of guilt, shame, or a tactical retreat, she had vanished from their lives as completely as she had entered. But her presence lingered. Some nights, Thomas still woke up in a cold sweat, remembering the moment he caught her leaving Daniel's room, or the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. Caroline struggled too, particularly with guilt. She replayed conversations in her mind over and over, questioning how she could have missed the signs. Daniel, in therapy, began exploring not just what had happened with Lena, but why he had felt so susceptible to someone like her. He confronted his insecurities, his identity outside of being the son, and began making independent decisions again. Eventually, Thomas and Caroline hosted a small family dinner. Just the three of them, no occasion, no guests. The table was set nicely, a roast in the oven, wine poured. The air was light with effort. They laughed a little, not the loud, unfiltered laughter they used to share, but something close, something that felt like possibility. Toward the end of the evening, Daniel raised his glass. To us, he said, voice steady, for not letting someone else define what kind of family we are. Caroline reached over and took his hand. Thomas raised his glass. They clinked, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by the scars they had chosen not to hide, by the pain they didn't ignore, they reclaimed what had nearly been taken. Their family hadn't survived because it was perfect. It had survived because it chose truth, because it had confronted darkness rather than denying it, because even when it was hardest, they chose one another, not out of habit, but out of love.